Now we can listen to a presentation from Christian Buhr. He's working on the European level as an economist and computer scientist. And he will tell us something about what's going on in the field of the European digital agenda.
Okay. So, I have been told to speak loud. I try to do that. I'm here today to tell you what we are thinking and hopefully also doing in Brussels in the area of open data and related aspects. And I have to click here. So I'm working for the European Commission with Commissioner Kroes, who you will see throughout this presentation mentioned, because she is really the one currently championing this topic in Brussels, and it is my task to support her in that, and obviously that of my colleagues. Why is the Commission a player in this whole area? Why do I come here and tell you about open data from the Brussels perspective? Well, that is because the Commission has various roles which all have a bearing on the development in this area. First of all, of course, the Commission is the institution that makes policy at the European level. So if the Commission doesn't propose something, it cannot be enacted by the Council and the Parliament, and therefore it is very significant what is being put into such proposals. You see this acronym there, PSI. Some of you will have heard that before. It means public sector information. We are still looking for a better title for this animal, but up to now, this is the acronym we are always using, so I'm using it here too. We have a directive on that, so a European law that needs to be implemented in all member states, which governs the requirement for public sector institutions to make available their data to users. And I will speak to that in more detail later. The Commission, of course, itself is a public administrative body. It collects data itself. It makes data available itself. It should do that more than in the past, like all the other public administrations in Europe. And we are working on that. I will talk about that too. And finally, of course, the Commission is also a funding agency. It is, in fact, the biggest funding agency in the area of research and innovation in Europe. The program is about 8 billion euros a year currently for all kinds of research, mostly technical research. There's only a small humanities part, but information and communication technologies is a big part in there, and that is the whole area for which Vice-President Kroes is responsible. And that is the lady here in the middle, who's my boss, but she's not the only commissioner. The Commission has 27 members, one from each member state, who are the decisional grouping in the Commission, and each of them has what we call a portfolio, so an area of responsibility for which they decide what will be proposed. So there's a layered process by which one of these decides that something should be done in their area of responsibility. They instruct their people in their, if you want, ministries, we call these directorates general, to write a proposal, and then she looks at that and sees whether she likes it, and if she likes it, she gives it to all her colleagues, and they all together discuss it and see whether that can be adopted as a Commission proposal. So it's quite a long process, but again, it applies what I said earlier. If something is not in her proposal, it will not be in the Commission's proposal. So it's very important to get the right things in there at that moment. Now, in this area of open data, there are a few others who are of importance. One of them is the guy up here, who is the French Commissioner, responsible for public procurement and intellectual property rights. And as some of you will have experienced in your dealings with the public sector when it comes to data, IPR are sometimes a barrier to the reuse of data or even to the making available of data in the first place. And so it is significant that we have somebody there too who traditionally has not been very, let's say, well, maybe I should say it differently. If you just listen to Richard Stallman, Mr. Barnier would certainly disagree with much of what Richard has said. I don't want to judge that at this point, but there are some challenges that we are facing internally too about this point, because there are some people that consider the public sector, like everybody else, has copyright in the data they create, and therefore nobody should be able to tell them what to do with it, which I found is not a very convincing argument, since public sector itself is there to serve the people, but this argument is still being made, so it's important to have these people in discussion so as to convince them. Then we have the research commissioner here, who, the bottom right, who pilots the research framework program and all the investments that we are doing in the research area, and also which also leads to lots of collection of data, obviously. And then, not insignificantly, we have this guy there, who's the Slovak commissioner, responsible for the internal IT of the Commission, among other things. And there you are directly in this area of how do we practice what we preach. I come to Brussels and say open data is great, everybody should give it, so what is the Commission itself doing? Now again, and that's a recurring theme in the Commission, we are pushing them to make the data of the Commission itself available in a more, let's say, more modern, more complete, more open fashion. And we're getting there, but it takes time. So that is a bit the tableau of the Commission. Now, what are we doing and what am I doing? I'm helping Neelie to write and execute the digital agenda for Europe. That's a document you can download, you can read it. By the way, this presentation is online already, and it has active links. So if you want to look at the sources, all these stuff are things are linked, so you can directly see what is behind all that. This is a document we adopted last May. The Commission as a whole adopted this. It's an action plan and a policy vision. And the basic proposition is that everybody should benefit from the potential increase of utility, increase of opportunities, increase of innovation that comes from the digital development. So not just companies, not just governments, not just individual people, not just patients, but all of them. And that already shows you that we're not talking about one or two things that need to be fixed, but we need to talk about many, many roadblocks that prevent this from happening in the best possible fashion. So it's really an evolutionary approach that says, well, let's identify the roadblocks that prevent this virtuous circle that is here a bit shown in this chart from working smoothly. And by removing one after the other of these, we can increase the speed and quality of the outcomes. That is the philosophy behind this. And we think, and Neelie considers that open data and the related areas are very good examples of exactly that. Because if you create problems by asking the public sector, by the public sector not giving out data they already have, you basically are a roadblock to further developments, further dissemination of information, further opportunities, both in the public and private sectors. So my own role is I'm part of a small team that around Neelie that advises her on all the policy areas for which she's responsible. So her portfolio has many different topics. Has many different topics. For example, roaming. You will hear something about roaming, which may interest some of you in a few days. That is in her portfolio. But we are also doing the information communication technologies research. We are doing standardization. We are responsible for the research policy in ICT for open access to research results and other areas. And I listed a few of them for which I am the main responsible advisor to her. So that's why I'm here today. Now, Neelie has been very vocal about open data in the last few months and last year. She has had to say this publicly about her position about what should be done by the public sector. So she says governments should embrace open data, and she says that in her ideal of e-government, so the way governments are using ICT for interacting with the people and with all the constituents, the reuse of public sector information is an important element that should be much further highlighted. And why is that? This is a very new quote. It's just 2 weeks old. Some of you may have been even in Brussels to the event. It was the Digital Agenda Assembly, a big event. We had 1,500 people there discussing all these policies for which she is responsible, all the areas of the digital agenda in 20 workshops. And we also had the pleasure to give out the awards for the Open Data Challenge, which helpfully has been organized by the Open Knowledge Foundations with partners over the last few months, and we are very grateful for that opportunity and the opportunity to link it with this policy process that we have in Brussels, because that helps, I think, both sides. It helps us to bring this topic more to the minds of our colleagues, and it helps the community to be more visible to everyone, not only publicly but also on the political level. We consider that open data is a very important topic and is a very positive topic. That is something you can explain to people, and it's something that can take with you many other elements which are otherwise difficult to explain. If you heard the talk from Richard, I think he's right about a few points, and one of the points, and also by Glyn earlier, the talk, they're right about the basic addition and positive impact of circulation of knowledge and availability of knowledge and the wide, quick dissemination of knowledge. And that we absolutely agree with. Now, we have to work in an existing legal framework, and so we try to make the best there. And open data is one wedge that can help getting there quicker, because in open data you don't have a music industry that sits on their profits and does everything to protect it. You don't have a publishing industry that protects a business model that may have to be changed, at least not everywhere. You have it here and there, but it's not an overarching theme in this area. And so there is an opportunity to really get to impacts very soon, and which is why we have seen that right now is the time to concentrate on this to get something done. Now, what do we do in terms of policy in this area? I mentioned already the Public Sector Information Reuse Directive. That's the difficult name of this animal. We are reviewing it. That means we are looking at this because it has existed since 2003, lo and behold, and we are looking at how it has worked in the past and what could be done to make it work better. Normally that is code for saying we will come later on with a new proposal. I think it's quite likely that we will, but it has not been decided yet. And the main and that is, I will give some details about that on the next point. We also have actions which are designed to bring together the community. So we have this action which you see in the background, the EPSI platform. There's a link to that too. They organize community building and events. I listed a few events here. I can just recommend to take a view of what they are doing and take a look and get connected. I know that this is a community that is already very connected to some extent, but there are more member states. There are many areas which are a bit wide still on this map, so it can make sense to do more of that. And we are certainly planning to do more of that in the future, because that is one area in which, even if you don't have a law, many things can happen. You don't need a law to slap a public administration to give their data out. They can just decide to do it. So if the two can go together, that would be a win-win situation and the best outcome. Of course, that doesn't mean that we want to get rid of this directive, because if there's no law, people may be less willing to talk about giving out their data. Currently, the PSI directive excludes three areas of public sector players, which are public broadcasters, cultural, educational institutions, and research organizations. So one of the debates that we're currently having is whether this exclusion should be removed, whether the applicability should be extended. That has not been decided yet, and therefore I cannot give you the answer of what will be proposed. However, it can be said that for broadcasters it looks very difficult, because there you're looking at the large decades-long archives of films, basically. And in many countries, things are organized in such a way so that the public broadcasters actually make money out of these things. And so to go there and say, well, with one new directive, all of this becomes basically reusable and publicly available, meets with a lot of resistance. So I'm not sure that we will be able to, or even thinking that it will be possible to get that. And if you don't think it's possible to get that, tactically it may make more sense not to put it on the table, because that will pollute the whole debate, because there are other important elements in this directive which we have to fix. On the research organizations, we have another strand of policies, which are the open access policies. I will mention that later, so it may not be actually needed to extend that to them so much, and which leaves the cultural educational institutions, national libraries, for example, museums, and so on. Many of those already, of course, have open data when it comes to metadata, to catalogs, to bibliography, and so on. But we are also talking about the works itself, I mean the material they have. And that links again to another debate I will mention later about Europeana and the digitization of European culture. So there is again another debate that plays into this, which makes it very difficult to really see whether everything should be put on this one card of the public sector information, or whether it would be better to split this in part and then have different fights. Because if you have different fights and you lose one, you can still win the others. If you put all in one, it can be that in the end you lose the whole fight because of one part. That's politics for you, but that's how it works. Importantly, and maybe more importantly, even if there's no extension of the PSI directive to new areas, there are other elements that are very important, namely, for example, the cost of the reuse of data. Richard said this morning that cost is a side issue. Now, I'm sure many of you have given some thought to this topic or even experienced it, and I think it may be a side issue, but depending on the size of the cost, that can very quickly become a main issue and actually prevent a reuse of the data. So we are looking at redefining the requirement for the public sector. So on what terms to make available the data. Currently, it says you must, basically you have to have your best effort, and you can charge for the data, and you can charge cost-oriented, so recoup your cost, and you can have an approach appropriate return on investment, which is of course quite a proposition because nobody really knows what an appropriate return on investment is. You have a lot of fragmentation across Europe and even inside member states about different types of data. So that makes it difficult to really do something across the one country or even the European Union. So we are looking at ways to make this sharper, to basically say, well, maybe you can charge to some extent, but not get a return on investment. It's more, this data has already been paid for by the public sector. Taxes have been used to make it. And so the cost should just cover the extra costs you have to actually put it on the website. And in many cases, this will not be a big costs. Another element there, which I don't mention here, but is very important also, is the machine readability of data. We have this element already now in the directive, but it's again a best effort requirement. And so you see this mindset in public administration often that they say, well, that is too, I mean, the table, that's too open. Let's make a PDF, or let's better print and scan a PDF and then put it online, because then the information is outside, but it's not really useful then for those that want to work with that. And really to tackle that is, in my opinion, together with the cost, the most important element of this review of the PSI directive, because most of the data we're looking at today would be then caught by that. So we're working on a review. There has been a public consultation, and the outcome of that will likely be a new proposal for a new directive. Maybe some tidbits from the public consultation. Many agreed, I think 90% agreed that of the respondents agreed that the PSI directive should be reformed, that it should be broader applicable, that it should be stronger in its requirements. However, a majority of the public sector bodies that replied have said, no, everything's fine, nothing needs to be done. So there you can see where the fault lines lie, and of course that is significant because the public sector bodies are part of the state. So they are working for the ministries, and the ministers are those that come to Brussels in the end to vote about this thing. So it is important and not to be neglected, the fact that these groups are, of course, like public administrations are, they say, well, this is more work, this is more cost, this is a change, so it requires me to think and do something, so it's better, better keep this at bay. So that is the situation we are grappling with, and of course that doesn't stop us from proposing something, but it shows that there will be a debate about that. And then, assuming we come out with a proposal that has all these nice things and extensions and more teeth to it, we have to give it to these two rather faceless institutions here, the Parliament and the European Council, who then have to both agree to it. And in the Council we have the member states. Each member state has a vote there, and they are very conscious, of course, of what happens in their own country. So it can happen that a minister from some country is best friend with the head of a department somewhere who makes some money by having an exclusive contract for their data with some operator, and that then causes that member state to say no. That has happened in the past, that can happen again. So a lot of conviction work is needed, and I think that is where everybody in such an audience and everybody in the wider community is also called upon to talk about this, to have publicity, to bring to the attention also of the politicians that this is an area that needs to be fixed and that can be fixed, and it is not lots of costs are associated with that. We like to portray it as an investment. So if you make this small extra cost of actually putting your data online, you have to look at this as an investment, because what you get back then is the enlarged activity by the private sector, both by non-for-profit activities, but also for profit-making companies who do these things. And there the important thing is only that we are looking at non-exclusivity. So we are not saying this data can only be used non-commercially or only for certain things. We say it should be as widely possible reusable, but it should not exclude others, because then you create a situation which is very similar to today, where you have exclusive licensing of some data to some operators who then again are monopolists in a fashion, have no interest to give the data to others or to charge less for it. Now coming to the Commission as a data collector, what is the kind of data that is covered? There's a peculiarity of the European system for you. The Commission itself and the institutions are not bound by the directives. So we make a directive that says you should do this or that, but they are not addressed to ourselves, they're addressed to member states, and the Commission itself obviously is not a member state. So we always have to mirror these kind of things in a new act, and this is this 2006 decision which the Commission adopted to basically put the PSI directive on its own law book so that it itself should comply with that. Then, of course, there are the same exclusions. but some data is covered. So the Eurolex, it's a very useful database. So you have all the law of the European Union, the different processes, updates in all the languages that are available back to 1957. So I think there's still some white parts where they have to translate the stuff from the 60s and 70s into the new languages that came to the Union in 2004 and 2007. But this fills up rapidly. So this is a very useful thing, and reportedly the likes of Google and others make lots of use of that to optimize their machine translation. And they should. That is a reuse of the type that I meant. No, the fact that Google uses this to improve their translation doesn't mean that somebody else cannot do the same thing. And so this has been paid for, and we are fine with that. Then TED, Tenders Electronic Daily. That's maybe interesting in light of another element I want to mention later about the Open Data Challenge. But here you have all the tenders in the European Union that have a certain size documented electronically. So there's a database that really people that are interested in these markets can mine, that they can monitor, that they can use, and this is a very useful data set. However, it's not yet available in the form that would be very easy to digest. So you basically have to scrape again to get to a real database. Then you have the Eurostat, which has lots of data. It can all be downloaded, but again, it is not really up to the, let's say, the current state of the art in terms of how you should have access to open data from the public sector. We have also data which is excluded, so there is of course material third parties have IPR on, so when the Commission makes an investigation, for example, or asks people their opinion and they send us a letter or a document or a report, then normally they have copyright on that, and we cannot just take it and put it online. Maybe we should do more of that, and when the Commission buys studies, for example, expert reports, it's one element that always gets put into these contracts, which means that the Commission gets the copyright ultimately, and that the stuff can be published and used. We have also direct research, so there are researchers in the Commission, about 3,000, and basically it's like the scientific service of the Bundestag or such institutions that make research directly for or inside an institution. Their research is currently not covered because there's an exclusion of research organizations, as I mentioned earlier. And then there are special cases, for example, in competition, if there's a dawn raid and we go to a company and look at all their books because we suspect them of being a cartelist, the material that is collected there obviously is not then to be divulged publicly because there's confidentiality and all these things in there. So we have it in a database, but it's not something that would be covered by any extension of the PSI. Now, where do we go from here on top of the PSI directive review? There is this idea, and last time I was here I was harshly criticized for it, but I will present it again, to have a portal and basically have two portals which ultimately should integrate. So first of all, next year there will be a portal and one that hopefully is more up, let's see, more up to the state of the art, in that it presents the data in a unified fashion, that we don't have Tenders Electronic Daily here and Eurostat there. They all have a different interface. They all have even partly different license agreement or license terms. So that have a unified access to this kind of data is the one thing. But the even more useful part of that is, of course, that we will go around in the Commission to all our colleagues and say, well, what data do you have on top of these PDFs that you put online or these Excel tables that you have here or there? And that, I think, in my view, is even the larger benefit that we will get from this, because it will raise the consciousness of my colleagues, and we are public administration like everybody else, that this is important and should be part of the job description to think about these things and to make the data available if it can be made available. Last time I was here I said there would be a tender for this, and in fact if there had been a tender for this, we would probably look at starting to do this in the beginning of 2012, because all these tenders are very fair and have a lengthy, very well organized process, and so we could have started the work in February or March 2012. Now it turns out there is already a contract, a general blanket contract for development work, and we're going to use that and be quicker with this portal. On top, there will be a development work towards a pan-European portal, and that's the point. Is really, it's not a huge database, it's not Brussels sucks in all the data, it is a federated approach. The idea is to link up the existing portals in different member states, in regions, in areas, so that you have a way to search across all of that you have a way to make the data visible to everybody, and we have similar things in the area of access to scientific information already. There are standards about the interconnection of metadata, for example, that automatically get communicated between the different parts of such a federation, so that ultimately from every point that you get into the system, you get access to all of the elements. That is the aim here, and we're looking currently really at a tender, which will come out in the beginning of next year, and then in 2013, the launch of this portal. And my philosophy in this, and we will be forced to follow that, is that this should start with what we have. I mean, the idea should not be that we build a portal, then we wait for all the data, and once everything is finished and great, we wrap it up and put it online. No, it should start with what is there, even if there are just 2 or 3 countries, because again, that will have an element of naming and shaming. You will show to people who has done his homework and who hasn't, and that can help push the agenda forward. Now, I have been signaled to be quick, and I will try to do that. Of course, we're also funding research in this area quite substantially. You see there's 50 million euros in 2011 for linked data, semantic web, and these things available. I think the call has already been launched or will be launched in a few weeks. And here just a few projects which are quite interesting, all of them. They are all linked from this slide, so you can have a look if you want. And the idea is, of course, to focus this kind of research that the Commission is funding on the kind of elements that we need to, or that have been identified as gaps. If you talk about standards for interconnection of metadata, for example, that could be one area. So basically the semantic web is an overarching label for this. Now, just very briefly, 2 slides about adjacent areas. Open access to scientific information. That has been a topic for a few years already in the Commission. We currently have a pilot project, which means that about 20% of the research the Commission funds, so it's about research to the tune of 1.5 billion euros per year, must be, publications coming out of this funded research must be made available in open access repositories, so free for everybody to download and use and read. And the Commission has announced in its Innovation Union communication last year that it will aim to make this the general principle. So not 1.5 billion per year, but 10 billion a year should cover this. There are some details still to be worked out, but ultimately this will be, or is seen as a very, very important signal that will be sent out, because it's not only the Commission doing that then, but the Commission is seen as a role model by the national funding schemes, for example. And so if there would be really a very strong signal from this, we hope that many others will come along, because despite being the largest single funder in Europe, it doesn't have the majority of the money. Most of the money still comes from member state funding, and so it's very important to get everybody lined up and do similar things. So we have lots of expectations here and hopes for open access to government-funded research. And that doesn't mean that the government has to fund it 100%. Basically, it means if you get a grant to do something and the grant covers 30% or 40% or 50% of your costs, then you will be required to get the grant to agree to make the outcome available in open access. We're also looking at scientific data, so there's a link between the open data and the scientific data. So here we're talking not about data that comes automatically out of the work of the public administration, but which comes from scientific experiments, right? So you have, for example, the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva and the CERN that creates lots of data. That is the type of scientific data I mean. It could also be smaller data sets. If you sit in your office and compute a database about 19th century novels, that ultimately is also a scientific data set. And so here we are looking at extending the ideas of the open access to publications to the area of data. This is a less mature field, and there are also concerns about the scientists, because every scientist wants to mine their data thoroughly before they give it to others, because otherwise the others may be faster than they are to publish. So there are some concerns there, but we're starting to move into that direction and to build an infrastructure. And there the Commission is also funding different projects that make this available, the opportunity to actually link the data that you have with the publications that you have in a fashion that is then again creating a new layer of data. So the idea is that you don't have a publication and then you drill down and then you find, this is based on the following table of data and that's it. No, we're looking about at a unified layer of scientific information which is linked via a common way of describing the metadata, which can then be used and reused by others in very much the same philosophical fashion as the public sector information to create more innovation and a faster growth of knowledge. And then final slide Digital culture. Those that have never been on Europeana, you should have a look. Maybe you should even help, because it's still a beta version. Now, this is not so bad, as we know from Google, but I think there are still some improvements to be made, even though the people are very engaged in Europeana. It currently holds, I think, 19 million digitized objects. These are films, pictures, books, postcards, all kind, even three-dimensional statues and so on have been digitized, now available there. And the aim here is, and this comes out of this expert report we had, where one of the authors was the head of the German National Library, and there were a few others in this group. They said it is possible by 2025 to have everything digitized. The whole European cultural heritage, everything that is in the national libraries, digitized and available for everybody in Europe, for reuse, for free. That is, I think, it's a very powerful vision. It will cost some money, but the work is ongoing already. There are cooperations with the private sector, and as I said, there are 19 million objects already in Europeana, and Europeana, similar to this portal I described earlier, is a federated structure. So it's federating the national digital libraries and making them available through a unified portal, so that there's an easy way to find things and to connect things. They're also very active in developing that. They have an API so that others can make easier reuse of the data. There has been a series of hackathons organized by Europeana in different European cities in the last few months. Quite interesting projects came out of that. You find all that if you go to the link down here, Europeana Labs. Can just recommend doing that. And we are looking there at ways to make this stable in terms of financing, because currently Europeana is financed under something which is called the competitiveness program. And it's a bit of a stretch to describe this as a competitiveness, because other people think about labor costs and raw materials and these kind of things. But I think it is possible, certainly. That's why we're doing it. But it's not really sustainable, also because this program will vanish in 2013. And so we are looking for new money to make sure that Europeana and this big database, which will ultimately have many dozens of millions of objects available for the foreseeable future, and not fall prey to, for example, the private sector or some players who want to take this exclusively or monetize on it, or to restrict access. And with that, I give you a few pointers here still. Some of them have been in the other slides as well. Others are additional here to make it easier for you to dig a bit into that, because I know that from the outside it can be a bit daunting to look at Brussels and to find out where the real things are happening. So I hope that these pointers will help you doing that a bit. And of course, I'm available to answer any questions you may have. And I think we still have 15 minutes, which is much more than I had last time. So please. Please.
My name is Helen Derbyshire from the NGO Access Info Europe. We work on access to government information across Europe and at the EU level. And I just want to ask you a question about a problem that we keep coming up across with the PSI directive, and to know if this has been taken into account in your review of it. Essentially, and I can give you an actual example from Portugal last week, we're doing some investigation into possible human rights violations that the Portuguese state was involved in. And we asked for various bits of information. The PSI directive has been incorporated into the Portuguese access to information law. And the response was, the initial response was, we hold this information, but before releasing it to you, could you tell us if you plan to reuse it and how? And the language of the PSI directive is so broad that it says any use other than the use for which the information was originally created. Our use is potentially to take human rights cases against the government. We don't want to tell them that at this point, because we want to get the information.
Yes.
But we're being asked to get a permission or even a license for how we're going to use the information. And this is just one example of a problem that keeps cropping up across Europe. I don't see how you get around that without a pretty radical change to the PSI directive.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are different elements to that question, of course, because it links, I mean, there are two aspects. One is the access to the information for transparency reason. The other is the access to information, as you said, and I'm not sure that it's a good idea to incorporate the PSI directive in the Access to Information Act, because normally those are designed to make sure that the state responds if somebody asks for data. With the PSI directive, the idea is of course different. The state should be proactive, just put it out there and not give a damn basically about what happens with that afterwards. So it's a very different philosophy. And in such cases where there may be some concerns in the state, you will always have the opportunity for the people to say, well, this kind of data, I don't want to give it to you. And then they come with funny things and say, well, please certify how you will use it. Now, legally, I think if you tell them you use it for X and then you find out that there's something in there which is actionable in court, I don't think they can do anything to you because you didn't tell them before. So that would be kind of a pragmatic advice.
Sure.
So, I mean, just to echo what you said, I think it will not be possible in the PSI directive to say, no, what it should say and will say is that it should be reusable to the largest possible extent, and there should be no prescriptive prevention of certain uses unless it makes sense. And this certainly is an area where there's no real reason to say that. It doesn't make sense for the state to say, I give you all the information you want unless I don't want to give it to you. I mean, that's an empty law then. But I think in such cases, which is not, let's say, the normal usage of PSI, because it's really at the link to the access to document and really to the discovery of what is going on in the public sector, where normally you look at documents, you say, well, can I get a copy of that letter sent that moment between those and those, or what has happened internally, that which is normally covered by access to information or freedom of information acts. I mean, you're right that there's a gray area between the two, and I'm not saying that in some countries PSI may not help to get people to this data, which would be great, but it's not the main purpose.
The problem is that Portugal is a country like France, where the PSI directive has been incorporated into the Freedom of Information Act. Even in countries where that hasn't happened, we're getting a lot of reports of this problem increasingly as people become aware of the PSI directive and then think that basically any use of the information can be licensed. So if you're just going to access it and read it, that's fine. If you're going to do anything with it, and that's been used to block access to information quite significantly now, particularly sensitive.
I mean, it's certainly an area we are discussing. What kind of license should be there? Should there be an obligation to have certain types of licensing? Should there be an obligation to look at different types of usage afterwards? So this is very much in the debate. And of course, again, similar to earlier points I made, we have this kind of trade-off discussion of, how far do we want to go in a proposal without risking the whole thing with that, but still getting a much better situation than we have today. And I absolutely believe what you say, that you get this report from many member states, because let's face it, in public administration it's a nuisance. Somebody comes and says, give me this data. People are not dumb, they will understand that if the data is not to their advantage, maybe it would be better for them not to give it out, and then they try to sit it out and be stubborn and try to invent also reasons not to give it. And we will have to, all of us will have to face that, which is, again, coming back to my initial point, which is why it's important now that we have the political attention to this. I mean, it's me, I can talk as much as I will. If the Commissioner wouldn't listen, that wouldn't make any difference. So it's very important that this opportunity and this time is used, and everybody is aware of that and tries to help it in their own areas. So if you work with the public sector, if you run against problems, you should be aware of that and try to also bring it to the attention of those that represent you in your national or regional politics.
In Norway, they have a very strict law about access to information. However, when we go and want data from public sector A, B, and C, they say, no, you can have it because of some weird-ass reason. And there have been talks about setting up a place where you can complain.
Yes.
They said that they meant this and this, and they actually do the litigation for you, like a publicly funded, publicly accountable institution. I was wondering if that was something.
Yes, that's one idea that we have also on our tables that is being discussed. Of course, you have. I mean, the initial response of my commissioner is always, well, let's create 27 new regulators, right? Because there's lots of bureaucracy also in that. But then discuss a bit more, and it could be attached to existing regulators like the Competition Authority or the telecom regulators, which are already offices. And the main point of that is just to have somebody who is institutionally responsible for this kind of thing, to whom you can then write and can say, well, this other administration over there, they seem to be unaware of my rights, or they seem to be unaware of their obligations, please help me. So this is another element which will not fix all the problems, not at all, but which can help move things forward along, because ultimately what we need is a change of the mindset of those people that work in these administrations. And it's happening. And I'm sure many of you know people that work inside these administrations who are totally agreeing with all you think, all of that, what you think, what should be done. But of course, they, like me, are working in a framework, in an area where they have to adapt and work with what they find there. It's not that they are, I mean, if it's the president of a country or something, that's maybe different, but for everybody else, they have to work out things internally. And so it is very important to have these champions of these ideas inside the public sector, and it happens. I mean, you have the younger people there, you have the people that understand these things. They also go through the motions as well. Der Marsch durch die Institutionen for the German-speaking audience here. I mean, that's happening in this area too, and I have very high hopes for that for the future. But we shouldn't expect that just because the Commission comes in 2011 or 12 with a new proposal that this happens at once. Such a proposal, just to end with that, it comes to the Parliament, and it takes 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, then it's a directive, and then the member states have 2 or 3 years to put it into their laws. So we are potentially looking at 2016 or 17 until the new law is on the books, which is a long time from now, which is why it's very important to not wait for that, but do these things in parallel, and use this political momentum also in the dealings everybody has with the public sector today. Yeah.
I really believe that public bureaucracies by default has a disinterest in opening up data, and at least in my country this is one of the biggest questions: how can we give good incentives to public organizations? And I think the European Commission might have a very considerable demonstrative effect in doing that. So could you share us any story, example of how far you could give a good incentives to the commissioners and to the public bureaucracy in the Commission?
Well,
large projects,
I mean, one thing is, which I think is very significant, maybe it's not apparent from the outside, but I mean, we are, as public administrations, not often very good at making use of this data ourselves. And so, but we also see the use or the utility of a good use of this data. And so if you have a project or examples where our data is used by others to do something which we have not been able to do, which is still important and useful for us, that is very powerful. And we're looking for these examples, which is why we were so happy about the Open Data Challenge and these things, because there you have, I mean, there's basically, you ask the public to say, here's the data, show me what I can do with it. And the point for us is, of course, then to turn around and to tell our colleagues, look, this is what we could have done. Maybe we should have done 10 years ago. We haven't been able to, and we didn't have the money to do that, and the people and the expertise. And here it's happening. So that's why it's an investment to do these things. And you have these examples about, in regional areas to do the reporting to your local authorities of problems in the streets, on fix my street or my potholes. It has different names in different countries. But this is, I mean, one wouldn't believe that because it's kind of a basic thing to let the responsibles know of the problems that they should tackle. But it's a very powerful example, and people understand.
It was not a Commission project.
No, that was not a Commission project. No. Yes. No, but I'm not saying that the Commission is a sum of 27 systems. So it's normally a fallacy to expect the Commission to be the first one to do something. It is rather that we look at the UK, doing the data.gov UK website and others, and say, well, this is a great thing. We need to do something for that on the European level. And then I find people like Neelie who say, well, I think that's great too, and I am in the position to push this a bit. And then things are pushed. Normally, the Commission is always very balanced in the middle of everything, which is why everybody complains ultimately. But hence, it is now a good time for this topic, because you have this situation where the attention is there and people push it. And of course, for the data, we are looking at examples, and we are hoping to have examples where our own data will be used and usable and helpful for people to demonstrate the utility of this. But as I said, this portal is being developed now. It will be there next year. There will be more data. I mean, nobody will dispute the utility of Eurostat statistics. Everybody needs these statistics who wants to do reporting, and there are lots of them. But there's also a difference in making people aware that they exist and presenting them in a way that that entices people to make use of that. Because right now you have to dig through a quite complicated menu structure, and then you get a zip file, and then you get some bland text files, and it's not really, I mean, it's not state of the art, and so we think we could do much better there to also entice again then the users and the community to come up with new things.
You said at the beginning that there is not one side, there's a resistance. You mentioned one of the commissioners.
Yes.
So what are the arguments of the other side?
Well,
against the openness?
well, there are different arguments. I mean, you have some southern countries where it's very clear that I mean, and not only southern, also in Germany, in some areas, you have exclusive contracts between public sector bodies and operators who pay for the data and then have exclusive rights over the data. And so this data is then, by definition, out of the scope. I mean, taken out of the applicability of this directive, and that shouldn't be the case, because like that, you create a new monopoly. Of course, there's some money flowing into the public sector, which then reduces taxes ultimately. So sometimes you may have to do a trade-off there. And I'm not saying that it's never a good idea to do this, but as a general principle, it should not be the case, right? Then now I lost the second part of your question. Okay. Yeah, yes. And the other arguments, of course, the IPR. I mentioned that argument earlier, that some people really consider, well, you cannot just go and tell the Department of X to give out their data. It's their data. Why would you tell them? And it's a nonsensical argument in my view, but it's still being made. And you cannot just say that's nonsense. Please go away. If these are the people that have to agree too. And so there's really lots of conviction work and the discussion that needs to be done, which is why it's so important that there is a community for this who can help in that, in every talk they have with somebody from this area. If you talk to the convicted, to the convinced, if you talk to the convinced, that's fine, and it's maybe even nicer for yourself, but more impact you will have if you talk to those that are a bit on the borderline or starting to move to speed things up. Yes?
Just come to the point of what's the counter arguments. Hargreaves' review of IP in the UK reported last month.
Yeah.
The UK government gets completed in Parliament on July the 7th. And your comments about extending open access to scientific data and his references to data and text mining. So that the data and text mining is getting the biggest pushback from rights owners, specifically publishers. So there's a recommendation for an exclusion, and that's where the biggest pushback is coming from.
Yes, well, it's obviously. I mean,
that's an example.
Yes, if you talk about scientific information, of course, the publishers are the pushback, because the publishers, they say, well, the pure rights holders, but I mean, in science, the rights holders are the authors, the scientists. They don't get any royalties for what they publish in the journal. They publish so that they can keep their post or find a post. Those that have the copyright and sell very dear subscriptions all over the place are the publishers. So they are interested, they have a vested interest, and they are the ones that have money to organize themselves and lobby us. And they walk through our offices regularly to tell their story and tell us how difficult this will be for them to sustain. Right? But I mean, this is the same that happens in many other areas that have been impacted by the internet and the new dissemination realities, let's put it like this. And just because somebody will have to change their business model doesn't mean that policy wouldn't be right. So absolutely, this is one of the counter arguments. But I think argument-wise, we are looking good. It's more ultimately the question who has the power. And in some countries, as I said, it may be that the public sector, the ministers sitting there, they have also. I mean, their views are influenced by many things, not only by good arguments, unfortunately. Yes.
I have a question about metadata and what you are doing to ensure that I can find the data that is relevant to me.
Yes.
Are you doing, for instance, geotagging and?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether we have so many pictures. I mean, we have satellite, we have database of satellite pictures because our scientists are operating some satellite programs. They are certainly, I mean, there's a geotagging element to that. On the other hand, what I would mainly answer is that, of course, the development of the portal and of Europeana. I mean, the idea is to make available and make it easier for people to find what they need. And so I'm talking about metadata standards. I'm talking about a federated system where metadata are exchanged. These are the kinds of things that we are doing there. And of course, I mean, I didn't mention that earlier, but in much of the research that we are doing, we are also then looking at, asking people to make available data. And if they make it available in documented formats or in standardized formats if they exist. So, but this is just bottom up. Even if you invest millions in projects, you have here something, you have there something like this, you don't fix an overall system. For fixing the overall system, you need the directive, you need a portal, you need the, the effect that has on everybody else who then say, well, there is no standard, they are using it, I should be using that too, so that everybody agrees. It's a network effect ultimately.
Hi, I'm Georgia Angelak. I work for Urbana, and I will be talking tomorrow about our efforts actually to put all this metadata that we have aggregated under CC0 license, hopefully. But from your presentation, I still didn't get why cultural institutions should be excluded from the PSI directive and your arguments there. I mean, we see, for example, the German National Library making 2 million a year out of reselling metadata to other public libraries, which means taxpayers actually paying twice for the same metadata. So,
no, I agree with that, and what I said was not that they should be excluded. I said currently they are excluded, and actually those, of the 3 areas that are excluded, research, broadcasters, and cultural education institutions, they are the most likely, they are those that we're really seriously looking at including currently, precisely with this reasoning. Whether ultimately the decision will be to include them or not, I think depends a bit on the technical assessment of the situation, what the member states tell us. Because of course it's not that we write this, put it on their desk and then say, what do you think about it? But it's also, the talks are going on, you go to the member states, you see what the department's thinking there, so they have a bit of a picture and an expectation what they will say when you come with certain types of proposals. So it is very possible, but this is not yet decided. I would certainly like to see that, but it's not for me to decide it ultimately. So that's why I cannot give you the full answer.
I wait in the back there and wanted to ask a question for a long time.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. Thanks very much. I have a couple of questions. I work for a non-profit organization and we are in the business of acquiring and publishing information, public sector information, putting it to different users. Now, the first thing is we have been having great difficulty, but varying degrees, with different governments in Europe in acquiring information. One is, it works in many cases where you go through another organization that is sort of trusted, by the government or the current party in power and that kind of thing. So one question is, how do you really overcome that kind of immediate difficulty in acquiring information? Will, for example, pointing these governments to this agenda really help? Saying that there is an agenda, so you have to necessarily implement it. You have to at least start by giving information that we require. That's the first question. The second question is, to what extent have the publishing standards themselves evolved in terms of information? One of the problems that we have is trying to accommodate all of this into one single, for example, organizational information, into one single taxonomy. Is there enough attention given to that kind of thing as well? In this?
So to the second question, yes, there's lots of attention, but it's not the Commission that makes standards. So we're having these research projects. Some of them themselves have created communities around them, and I think things are looking good there. The fact that there is a community is also visible in these projects. We are doing something on the standardization side too to make it easier to have standards in place, and we are very aware of the need of having standards in this area. So I think it is as good as it gets at the moment, short of having the PSI directive pronouncing that you should use standard X or Y, and that I think would not be a good thing because it would be too prescriptive. On the first question, I think it helps on the margin, pointing out there is a law, here it is, it says the following things. Now, if they are very stubborn, maybe they read it and they find out that the current PSI directive is a bit of a toothless tiger, in that it establishes a principle and says you should do that, but if you don't do, not many bad things happen, which is precisely why we are looking at the review now and try to get a step further. You have to see this, when we first did this, the same debate that we have now took place in 2001, so 10 years ago, and there was no such community, or it was much smaller. There was not much public attention to this topic, and so we had a few colleagues who were pushing very much. They had the same opinion since 10 years, but politically it was not possible to get more at that time. Now it is possible to get more, and we hope very much that there gets more. Now the main element under overarching everything is of course the change of the mindset, because it should not depend on who you are, whether they give you the data or not. That's the principle. That's the wrong way of looking at things. Now of course people are still looking at things in that way, which is why it will take time to solve this problem. And you need to build trust, and you need to actually do the jump to the water. Once you put it online and just go away for a week and see what happens, and your house still stands afterwards and your administration still functions, maybe people will learn about this. And that's my hope, that all the projects that are going on, all the elements that are happening will contribute to that.
You say some of these countries are sort of in the forefront in actually enacting this?
Yeah, I mean, on the country level, on the legal level, there's lots has happened in the UK. Obviously, lots has happened in France recently. The Danish are interested nowadays. The Polish are interested. I mean, things are happening now, but I think it still depends very much on the specific administration and the people in there. Because if you have somebody who is responsible but has never heard about the PSI directive, and then somebody knocks on the door and says, I am somebody from an organization you've never heard of, I would like to have your data, and here's the law that tells me you should give it to me, they will first say, well, wait a minute, and then they will go to the office and think a bit and maybe talk to their colleagues. And if there's somebody there that knows about this, it will be much more likely that they will give it to you than if they don't know somebody there, which is why I think it's very important to build this community also inside the administrations.
Thank you.
Let me interrupt here because maybe some of you miss your food, which is now served downstairs. Maybe those of you, and I can imagine we can sit here for hours. There are a lot of questions to you. Maybe you just grab Christian and ask him by yourself. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the questions.